Wild Hearts of Wyoming by Simon Cross. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1875. Emma Bradford stepped down from the stagecoach, her gloved hand gripping the wooden rail as she surveyed her new surroundings. After 2 weeks of grueling travel from Boston, the sight of the frontier town both thrilled and terrified her. "Watch your step, miss," the driver called out, already busy unloading her trunk. Emma gathered her skirts, mindful of the mud despite her exhaustion. Her new position as the town's schoolteacher started in 3 days, barely enough time to settle into the boarding house and prepare for her first class. The sound of thundering hooves drew her attention. A group of riders approached, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. Leading them was a man whose mere presence commanded attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a strong, weathered face that spoke of years under the western sun. "Mr. Sullivan," someone called out. The cattle made it through Devil's Pass. The man, Sullivan, dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size. His eyes met Emma's briefly across the street, and something electric passed between them. He tipped his hat slightly before turning to speak with his men. Emma felt her cheeks flush and quickly looked away. James Sullivan, she would later learn, was one of the largest cattle ranchers in the territory. He was also on the school board that had hired her, a detail that made her pulse quicken uncomfortably. The boarding house proved to be a tidy 2-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson, whose warm welcome helped ease Emma's nerves. "You'll get used to the West, dear," she said, showing Emma to her room. "Though I dare say it might take some time for the West to get used to you." Emma understood her meaning. With her Eastern education and refined manners, she stood out like a silk ribbon in a pile of leather straps. But she was determined to prove herself capable of handling frontier life. Over the next few days, as Emma prepared her classroom and lesson plans, she couldn't help but notice James Sullivan's frequent presence in town. He carried himself with quiet confidence, treating everyone from the bank president to the stable boys with equal respect. Unlike some of the other ranchers, he spoke softly and thoughtfully, though there was steel beneath his gentle manner. Their first real conversation happened outside the general store, where Emma was struggling with an armload of books and supplies. As several volumes threatened to topple, strong hands steadied both her and her precarious load. "Allow me, Miss Bradford." His voice was deep and warm, like honey over gravel. "Mr. Sullivan." Emma forced herself to meet his gaze. "Thank you. I'm afraid I was a bit too ambitious with my purchases." "A common affliction among schoolteachers," he said, his eyes crinkling with amusement, "though I've never met one quite so determined to single-handedly empty Mr. Peterson's entire stock of books." As they walked toward the school, James carried most of her supplies while asking thoughtful questions about her teaching philosophy and plans for the school. Emma found herself sharing her hopes of bringing new ideas to the classroom while respecting the practical needs of a frontier community. "These children need more than just reading and figures," she explained passionately. "They need to understand the world beyond Wyoming, while still appreciating the unique beauty and opportunity of the West." James nodded, studying her with an intensity that made her nervous. "You're different from what we expected, Miss Bradford." "Is that a criticism, Mr. Sullivan?" "No," he smiled slightly. "It's a compliment." Over the following weeks, Emma threw herself into teaching, gradually winning over both her students and their parents with her dedication and innovative methods. She learned to adapt her lessons to include practical applications, using cattle counts for arithmetic, local geography for science, and frontier history alongside classical studies. James began finding reasons to visit the school, initially under the guise of board business, then more openly to assist with repairs or donate books. Emma found herself looking forward to their conversations, which ranged from literature to ranching, from Eastern politics to Western expansion. One afternoon, as thunder rumbled in the distance, James arrived at the schoolhouse just as Emma was finishing for the day. "There's a storm coming," he said without preamble. "Let me drive you home." Emma hesitated, but the darkening sky made the decision for her. In his buggy, they raced the storm back to town, the air heavy with electricity. When the skies finally opened, James wrapped his coat around her shoulders, the wool warm with his body heat. "You know what they say about western storms," he said, his voice barely audible above the rain. "They're like love, wild, unexpected, and they change everything in their path." Emma's heart thundered louder than the storm. "Is that what this is, Mr. Sullivan? A storm about to change everything?" He turned to her then, his eyes intense. "I think it already has, Miss Bradford." "Emma." The first time he kissed her was 2 days later behind the schoolhouse after helping her hang new maps. It was gentle but sure, like the man himself, and Emma felt as though every story she'd ever read about love finally made sense. Their courtship raised eyebrows in town, the refined Eastern schoolmarm and the rugged cattle baron. But those who knew them saw how perfectly they complemented each other, her passion for learning balanced by his practical wisdom, his quiet strength enhanced by her gentle refinement. Emma discovered sides of James few others saw: his love of poetry, his dry humor, his tender heart beneath the tough exterior. He showed her the beauty of the frontier, teaching her to ride and helping her appreciate the wild majesty of Wyoming's landscapes. In turn, she helped him see his world through fresh eyes, bringing new ideas to both the school and his ranch operations. Together, they began planning improvements that would benefit the entire community: a larger school building, a proper library, better roads. But their happiness faced its test when Emma received a letter from Boston. Her father had fallen ill, and her family needed her to return home. The choice seemed impossible: her family duties in the East versus her heart in the West. James found her crying in the schoolhouse late one evening. Without a word, he gathered her into his arms, letting her sob against his chest. When she finally told him about the letter, his response surprised her. "Then we'll go together," he said simply. "I'll help you care for your father, and when he's recovered, we'll return. Or we'll stay in Boston if that's what's needed. My ranch manager can handle things here." Emma stared at him, stunned by his willingness to upend his entire life for her. "James, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He took her hands in his. "Emma Bradford, I've loved you since the moment you stepped down from that stagecoach, looking so proper and determined. These past months have only confirmed what I knew then, that you're the other half of my soul. Will you marry me?" Through her tears, Emma smiled. "Yes, I love you." They married 2 weeks later in the newly expanded schoolhouse, with Mrs. Henderson beaming in the front row and Emma's students scattering wildflower petals. James wore a proper Eastern suit that made him look somewhat uncomfortable, while Emma wore a simple white dress adorned with Wyoming wildflowers. Their life together became a blend of East and West, refinement and ruggedness, passion and practicality. They traveled to Boston, where James charmed Emma's family despite their initial reservations. After her father's recovery, they returned to Wyoming, where they built a life that encompassed both their worlds. The school flourished under Emma's continued guidance, even after their children began arriving. James's ranch prospered, implementing progressive methods that other ranchers soon copied. Together, they helped Laramie grow from a frontier town into a thriving community that valued both education and tradition. Years later, Emma would sometimes pause while watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in impossible colors. She would think about that first storm-swept ride with James, about how love, like the West itself, had the power to transform everything it touched. And every time, as if reading her thoughts, James would appear beside her, taking her hand in his. "Any regrets?" he would ask, though he knew the answer. "Only that I didn't step off that stagecoach sooner," she would reply, leaning into his embrace as they watched the sun sink behind their mountains, their hearts as wild and true as the frontier itself.